Thank you, Simon. Well, now, what we're going to do is we've had 4 contributions. What we're going to do is have a small discussion on stage, and then we're going to throw it out to the audience for 5 minutes. Then we're going to move on. We're going to move through 3 areas of discussion, each one followed by a short question period. The areas, in the spirit of true sustainability, are triple bottom line. So we're going to talk about the economics, the social and the environmental consequences of tall buildings in London. We're going to start, actually, with the economics. And I wanted to ask all of you whether you think that London needs more buildings to stay. This issue of staying at #1 economically, being an international city, does London need to retain that identity and that status, and do tall buildings help it to do that? Peter?
I don't think that it's tall buildings that help it to do that. I think it's simply a case of making sure that we've got the quality floor space that the inward investors want and that the occupiers are going to take. When you have an insurance company prepared to move its headquarters from Chicago to the City of London, it would be a brave person who would say no. When the largest bank in Switzerland wants to move its headquarters effectively to the City of London, it would be very brave and strange to say no. And those are all things that have happened within the last 2 years. In a country where we've expertly got rid of our energy industry and our car industry and our aeronautical industry, it would seem perverse to also get rid of our international business industry, which is what London is and what helps to generate money for the economy. So it's a matter of achieving the floor space. And as I say, to me, building high is a last resort in that aim.
Simon, you mentioned that Peter had effectively tried to zone tall buildings within the city. Is that right, Peter? By creating a dome, a mass of
yes,
buildings?
to cluster them together away from St Paul's so it doesn't affect any of the protected views. And the reason, by the way, why the walkie-talkie isn't in the cluster is because it's intended to provide the viewpoint, the city's assembly rooms, the one isolated building from which you can look back at the cluster or outwards around London. So that was a deliberate part of that.
How will you be able to do that when it's occupied by banks?
Just by being bloody difficult.
So, can members of the public get up there and
oh yes,
enjoy
well,
that?
the top 3 floors of it are publicly accessible and free.
You build a really ugly building to look at the beauty of the other building.
You wait till it's finished.
Terrible building.
Can I take Peter up on one thing? I mean, I totally buy the importance of a city looking prosperous and being attractive to businessmen. I mean, I can remember back in the 70s, or the 80s at least, endlessly being told by estate agents, whatever you do, please don't let them build these tall buildings. We want large floor areas. We want decks. We want the sorts of things you get in slabs and Dockland and so on. There's no shortage of land in London. Let's just kill that. There's a huge amount of land. The question is what price you're prepared to pay for it. But the skyscraper has nothing to do with that. The skyscraper once had to do with frankly, looking virile, sort of banana republic reason for building tall. But it's not necessary for the London economy to build skyscrapers. It really isn't.
Well, it is if people want to be in certain locations. Because of the 19th century transport network we have, there are only 2 parts of London where you can get more than 90% of your employees to work by public transport, the West End and the City. Now, for very good reason, and I would agree with you, I don't think it's appropriate that the West End should have high-rise buildings. Therefore, it's only the City that's equally accessible. The minute you start building a Canary Wharf, which after all is only the 21st century's Croydon, it's a satellite of central London. It's designed for overspill. It can only be successful by there being a strong centre for it to gravitate around. But the minute you start moving off-centre, you can't trawl the same population for your skills, and you can't get them to work by public transport. So that's why I think we need to get it all, and should be the only reason.
Yeah, I think Croydon personally is the 1960s version of the Canary Wharf, but this throws back to a point you made about the way that we come to accept tall buildings. Simon doesn't like the Vignoli building that's going to go up, the razor, the lady shave, whatever it's called, the walkie-talkie, and but you make this point that it takes time to accept and to come to like tall buildings, and as indeed any new idea in architecture.
Yes, I think that's the case. But the thing that worries me about the economics, and it's not just tall buildings actually, is the fact that London seems to be becoming the world's property bank. And I think that's a real worry, just in terms of people buying flats and then not living in them, and then creating a dark city and London losing its vitality. I think that's the kind of economic thing. I mean, it's not necessarily tall buildings; it's also shorter buildings, but that's in terms of economics, that's I think a worry.
Rowan, do you see these buildings, particularly in the city, as short-term solutions? Are they thrown up with short-term lives in order to be then torn down and replaced, unlike St Paul's?
Well, tall buildings are harder to knock down and rebuild, and they're sort of less responsive and flexible for that reason. That can be a problem with them. I mean, what I'd like to deal with is this question, this idea that you have to build tall to kind of keep your place in the global city race. Because if that's the case, then London has hopelessly lost. I mean, with the Shard, we've just about caught up with the Chrysler building, which was completed 80 years ago. I mean, what sort of statement of urban virility is that? It's half the height of the Burj Khalifa, or less than half, maybe.
Half, yeah.
And, you know, we're not going to win that game. And also, the place that had the tallest buildings in Europe, as Peter alluded to, for quite a long time, was Frankfurt, with the Messerturm and the Commerzbank by Norman Foster, from the kind of early 90s until, I think, late noughties. During that period was a period in which, at the beginning of that period, Frankfurt and the City of London were seen as level pegging as Europe's financial centre. At the end of it, there was no question but that London was the financial capital of Europe. That seems to suggest that building very tall buildings in Frankfurt did nothing for them. So, simply that argument doesn't wash.
There's an interesting counter-argument, which is that the reason the Shard is the height it is and not twice the height, because I think it was originally intended to be 300 metres taller, was that Piano was prevented from building taller by the Civil Aviation Authority, who said that we're going to put a cap of around about 1,000 metres on the skyline of London.
300 metres, 1,000 feet.
Yeah.
Yes.
Yes. Sorry, I beg your pardon. Yes, in feet meters. So it's 1,000 feet, and it'll remain thus, and as will every other building in London.
Yeah.
There we are. We just built everything to 1,000 feet tall, and we'll all be happy. Let's throw some questions open to the floor about this issue. I'd like to know what people think of these other developments outside the city boundaries, perhaps those along the banks of the Thames on the south side, up towards Battersea and beyond. Any questions? Lady there. We've got a roving mic, so speak loud and clear into that.
Hi, my name is Roma Agrawal. I'm a structural engineer, and I actually spent 6 years of my career designing the Shard, so I'm very interested to hear what everyone's been saying about it. I think I just wanted to come back to your point about losing industries such as aeronautical and cars and things, and I think apart from just losing business space and office space in the building, in London, if we don't build tall and build these really innovative buildings, we're going to lose our structural engineering industry as well. And I think these tall buildings are really giving us an opportunity to do some very exciting, very, very clever things. On the Shard itself, we've done 3 or 4 things that have never been done before in the world. So our engineering is at the forefront, and I think it's very important to have those opportunities.
Does our architecture reflect that? Does our architecture reflect any kind of preeminence in our building services, design and engineering? Julia?
Sorry,
Does our architecture, does it display that kind of preeminence, do you think?
Well, I think it clearly does, but I mean, on a global stage, really. I mean, architects from this country are building all over the world, and I think are very highly respected.
And indeed our engineers, yeah.
Yes,
I mean,
and indeed the engineers, absolutely. Yes.
But we don't run the planning system for the benefit of engineers and architects.
No,
but
it doesn't have to be in London.
Do we build aircraft carriers because we've got beautiful aircraft carrier designers? I mean, I totally sympathise. I mean, at my job, I'd say what you said, but that's not the purpose of the planning system. I mean, with the planning system supposedly designed to allocate resources, and in this case, the matter we're discussing, in the most attractive way possible for the skyline. As far as I'm concerned, if there's a banker in Zurich or Frankfurt who doesn't like it, he can go back to Frankfurt and Zurich. I just don't buy it anyway that that's the case. We are actually discussing the design of a city. We're not discussing anything else. We're discussing the design of a city. And if we stop doing that, we may as well talk about something else.
Let's take another question. Gentleman there.
Thanks. There's an aspect to this discussion that hasn't really emerged yet, which is it's been suggested that it's not necessary to build tall buildings. And I think you can kind of turn that on its head and say, well, in our society, generally speaking, you don't need to demonstrate a need to do something in order to be allowed to do it. And Parliament held a select committee about 10 years ago that considered the subject of tall buildings and concluded roughly that there wasn't a demonstrable need to build tall buildings, but equally it was clear that people wanted to build them, so on the whole you needed to have quite a good reason to tell business that they couldn't. Simon Jenkins used the word earlier, rather revealing verb, that there's nobody who can dictate London's skyline. Well, the people who do dictating are generally dictators.
Given, Peter, I think, pretty robustly defended the need to build in greater density within the square mile to attract commercial
important
tenants.
point. I mean, if you think back to the medieval village, when they earned a bit more money and did well with the sheep farming, they'd extend the church tower and add a steeple. But they weren't doing that to prove they were very religious. It was one finger to the next village. They were showing off. And the City of London, with its tallest building in Britain, with the old St Paul's spire, the dome of St Paul's, it was all doing the same thing. So I think it's true that man and woman, mankind, shall we say, does like to mark its skyline and mark its success. What galls me, and this is something that Simon can say more about because he's written about it very eloquently, is building tall to be a home for gangster cash. I mean, all the way along the south bank of the river, we have buildings which are not going to be occupied. They are homes for money that at the very least hasn't paid tax and is probably of much worse origin than that. Coming to London to be put into 1 or 2 or 3 apartments which are going to be kept locked apart from the 1 day a week when the maid goes in to clean them. Now, to me, to pay an environmental price on our skyline for building the sort of stuff that has got them into trouble in Cyprus all over London, I think that's a crime. And I'm really upset by that. And I don't see that as at all the same as building tall to house jobs, to be more competitive, and to be the number one in a particular field of endeavour. But Simon knows a lot more about this than I do.
Well, just picking up on the question, I mean, if you really are saying that if someone wants to build a tall building, that becomes a necessity. In other words, it's an economic fact. I agree. If someone wants to do something, it's a need. But if you're really going to say the planning system is going to be, it's not going to exist, it's going to be subordinated to people's wants, the wants being, in these cases, the wants of money. I mean, I'm fairly right-wing, I'm pretty capitalist and all these things, but I do actually rather favour planning. We're not making any more land, we're trying to do the right thing with it, we're trying not to produce another Detroit or another parts of New Jersey or whatever, we're trying to produce a community that we find not only convenient, but beautiful. And honestly, if you don't agree with me, we haven't got a conversation. At the moment, there's a huge row going on about whatever it is, 12-metre extensions at the backs of houses. I've got a certain sympathy with Nick Cole. I've been trying to build an extension at the back of my house. But I mean, clearly, there's got to be some control over this, or it's going to be war. What seems to have happened now is architects have totally sided with old-fashioned Thatcherite economics. They say, if I want to do it, if I've got a developer, let me do it. Get out of my eyes, get out of my hair, or whatever. I mean, it is not a sensible way of approaching the debate. And I just simply say, I think we haven't come near it yet. If we're talking about the skyline, we've got to discuss what is a beautiful skyline. If you just don't believe in that, there's no conversation.
We'll come on to the issue of skyline next, I think, when we talk about the environmental impact of these buildings. And that includes their visual impact, of course. Andrew Lawrence, Director of Project Research at Barclays Capital in Hong Kong, said building booms are a sign of excess credit, which suggests that buildings happen not in response to need, but in anticipation of crash. What about buildings like the Shard and those buildings going up alongside the river, along Battersea? I come back to these buildings because they're outside of your remit, Peter. Is it easy to identify need in those cases? No, I think they're products of speculation, and speculation is part of the economy that we have, and it's a kind of inescapable part of that economy, and always has been. But there's not a crying need for them, as other people have said. A lot of these places are in fact empty. And the point is that when you put up a building, a tall building, you're making a profit out of something that is common to a city, which is the airspace, the view of the sky, which is not to say you can't do it,
But it means you have to make a positive case for doing it, in my view. You have to convince the rest of the city through the medium of the local authorities and the planning process that there is a positive reason why you should do that. And I don't believe that's what's happening in London now.
Which rather suggests, we move on now to this issue of skyline, because I know you'd like to discuss that at length, Simon. But the point is that all architecture has this role, doesn't it, a public role, and that large buildings in cities take on that role ever more powerfully and dictate and create the quality of our public realm, that we interact with these buildings. It's not just simply about what we look at from the top of Hampstead Heath. It is also about how we interact with them at ground level, at the ground plane, as people who can't access these buildings normally. They are forbidden territory for us. Is there not an instinct, is there not a natural unhealthiness in that composition of roles and our lack of contact with these places? Is that not a naturally unhealthy thing to be happening in our cities?
Carry on.
Yes. No. Yes. I mean, tall buildings always make it tougher to design the ground level. It's a more challenging architectural proposition, partly because of things like the wind effects, etc., but also just because of the scale of the object, which then has to come down to the pavement. That's a challenge which good architects can deal with and have dealt with, but it requires a greater degree of effort on the part of the architects, and we're just not seeing that effort being put in to the vast majority of tall buildings in London. I mean, usually they make a kind of contribution to the public realm, which involves kind of repaving the space in front of the... In fact, usually it involves pedestrianising over the roundabouts that were built with a planning gain from their predecessors 40 years ago. And it seems to cost more money to get rid of the roundabouts than it did to put them in the first place. And then maybe I might put a bit of art in. But what seems to be almost completely lacking is the idea of making a space in 3 dimensions in conjunction with other things around that are either there or might be there in the future, which for me is fundamentally what architecture's about. But if I stand outside Strata, Vauxhall Tower, or in fact the Gherkin at ground level, or the Shard really, I mean it makes some gestures, and I just don't see it. It's just not there. The architects haven't bothered, and the planners haven't bothered to make them do it. And you know that's there's no reason for that. I mean, this city is supposed to have some of the greatest architects in the world. We have an incredibly elaborate planning system. There's an awful lot of money going to these buildings. Why can't we do better? It's beyond me.
Well, I mean, I think we should learn from the lessons. I mean, for example, the Economist building that, I had up, is a really good example of a tall building creating spaces between, well, it's a number of buildings, and it creates spaces between the tall buildings. I think that's a really good example of it being well done. I think the Millbank Tower is a different way to do it with the podium. And also, I think it's well done. I mean, it's possible to do it. I mean, I agree that it's not always getting done. I think, we need to make sure that good architects actually follow through. Particularly, when a planning application is granted. I actually think that the planning permission should be tied to that good quality architect. I mean, sometimes you get a situation whereby a good quality architect is used to get planning permission, and then the developer will then bring on a not quite so good architect to actually realise it. I think that should be something that the planning system takes up and actually has a rule that says no, that's not.
So how do you do
right.
that, Peter? I mean, how do you make a skyline which appeases Simon, and where the cumulative arrangement of the components is pleasurable?
Well, I think that's where the planner comes into their role, because we are concerned with placemaking as opposed to creating an object, a single building. And it's how the buildings go together. I hope that we've given as much attention in the city to our urban spaces and our networks of alleyways and protecting them and enhancing them as we have to creating the extra floor space at a very accessible location. There's an interesting conference coming up, and I'll give a plug here, beginning of July in the old brewery in Chiswell Street in the city. the CTBUH, the Council for Tall Buildings and Urban Habitat, are coming from Chicago to have their World Conference in London, and they're calling it Height and Heritage. But I always think the interesting thing with them is that it's the Council for Tall Buildings and Urban Habitat, like it's an add-on. And I'm going to be pushing the urban habitat bit rather than the tall. I did say to them I thought they ought to have a talk entitled Base over Apex, because we've spent far too much time on the tops of these buildings and far too little on the base of them.
Mm.
But so often one reads of English heritage objections to a new building, one reads so often of UNESCO's objections to a new building going up in the city, about the way that it's going to damage a view of St. Paul's from a particular sightline, the way that it's going to, as been expressed, the integrity, the historic and visual integrity of the Tower of London even threatened. How on earth can you justify the pursuit of such rapid high-rise progress at the expense of the damage to the historic fabric of what we have?
Well, that's the importance of clustering. If you have a cluster of tall buildings at Canary Wharf, to make it a viable proposition to have a satellite business centre outside central London, if you maximise the cluster in the part of the city where you're not interfering with protected views in order, again, to maximise its benefit and its strength, and maybe the same to regenerate Croydon. But if you cluster them together, then you're going to block less views. Once you start dotting them all over, I mean, that's why the city objected to the Shard, not because we wanted it in the city or that we wanted to have all the tall buildings, but because it was slap bang behind St. Paul's Cathedral in the view from Parliament Hill. It wasn't a case of not liking the design or the fact that they had a tall building. It was just breaking all the rules. And the interesting thing was, it wasn't the local authorities. It was the same with the St. George's Tower down at Vauxhall. That Lambeth recommended refusal. It was John Prescott approved both the Shard and the Vauxhall Tower in just totally ignoring his own national planning policies.
Simon, I want to ask you about not just for you, whether or not you accept the argument that with any building, and that includes a collection of tall buildings, you can do great placemaking and create good quality public realm.
Well, I mean, London is a wonderful city, and the great thing about London was that it was relatively even, and the real challenge in London was to go from a 4-storey module up to a 7-storey module over the course of what might be called the late 20th century period of redevelopment. And that's what happened in St. James's, or what happened across most of the West End. It accommodated vast amounts of use of space. You could do it. You can build high-density, low-rise quite easily, and some of the most exciting modern buildings in London are that. You haven't begun south of the river to do that. I mean, there's just a huge amount of opportunity for property development in London, which provides more space at low rise. I regard these tall buildings as creatures from outer space. They're just aliens. They've arrived here and they've been plonked down at about 12 places without any, apart from Peter's cluster, without any real relationship with each other. You wouldn't do 3 shards in Bermondsey. It's just a shard. Or would you do 3 shards in Bermondsey? I just don't know what architects think anymore. But I mean, presumably, if you like high buildings, you like lots of them. If you don't like lots of them, say how many. Say why a few. Is there an aesthetic relating to the planning of high buildings in London, or isn't there? I never get a straight answer.
You're after a really coherent, large-scale master plan, aren't you? A visionary master plan.
Every other city in the world has one.
Yeah, but we have a planning system that doesn't allow that, because uniquely in the world we have a precedent-based planning system like our legal system. So once you get permission for one building, you've effectively sold the pass, as it were, on the very next one that comes along. In the rest of the world, you have a pre-planned master plan planning system, which we don't have.
But even you, Peter, do you think there's a limit to the number of towers there should be in the East City?
Oh, yes, absolutely.
How many?
Well, I don't think we're going to see, we won't see the same number again added to the cluster, probably no more than 10 in total.
And that's about right. I mean, you've got a vision of how many are right. Well, I mean, you're the only person running planning in London to do that.
Who has the vision?
But I mean, we do. I think this is an important point, because there's a tendency for everyone to get kind of very negative and defensive, and what we really need is a positive version of what this future London is, that has tall buildings in it and has areas without tall buildings. And in spite of what Peter says, we do have a mayor. We also have a view management framework. We have very specific planning laws controlling certain views of St. Paul's and the Palace of Westminster and a few other crucial views, which are very rigorously enforced. But what is not covered by that framework, which is most of the city, is There are no rules at all. So it's sort of chaotic. And if we are capable of having a framework of protected views of St. Paul's and the Palace of Westminster, and if we have a mayor who in theory is got the future of the city at his heart, who has planners and architects working for him, why is it so difficult to create a positive version of what a London of tall buildings could be like? And this mayor and the previous mayor haven't done it.
This mayor pledged before he came to office that outside the cluster there'd be no more tall buildings in central London. He broke his promise.
We're going to be talking about the social impact of these buildings shortly. Before we do, let's just throw it out to you and ask you if you have any questions. You might like to pick up on some of the environmental points you've mentioned, which are to do with context and landscape and skyline, or you may have some questions about the environmental performance and sustainability of these buildings. There's a question here.
This is Yamna Asif. I am a student of architecture, and my thesis is due in the end of this year. So the topic I've decided for my thesis is Skyline of London. I'm giving that thesis in Pakistan. So the reason why I decided to pick London was London has a very human kind of architecture. What was in my mind, that human is given importance. Unlike Manhattan, there the grandeur buildings say that they are, human is nothing, but development can be, they have no limits. But here, what I believe that human life, quality of life, and nature, they all given importance. If we go to high rises or skyscrapers, my question is, will the human level of the city continue? Will you be able to solve all the natural requirements of the nature? You cannot change the nature, and when you are imposing a huge structure, there are so many liabilities with that. And they are not even being considered, what I'm getting from this discussion so far. So,
thank you. So, just to recap, the issue here is how, in a city which has grown accretively over 2,000 years slowly to low levels, as a series of connected villages, how that organic and flexible, adaptable mechanism, how that organism indeed, can cope with the arrival of these big statements, these kind of large, egotistical, single acts, which the questioner's suggestion is that it can't.
I mean, it's definitely a downside of tall buildings anywhere, that they they tend to require such things as air conditioning, higher levels of servicing, much more structure in relation to the habitable space, therefore more concrete, more steel. They have some advantages in that they, if they create greater density in a city, then that can make the public transport work more efficiently. But there are certain environmentally negative aspects to any tall building from the outset, which it then has to kind of compensate for. And I think that should, in the debate, that should be taken into account. Also, and what I find really bizarre is in residential tall buildings, it means you can't open the window. If you live in a tall building, you can't open the window. And I find that extraordinary that someone would want to pay £1 million for a flat which is like being inside a kind of Ryanair jet.
I'm not sure that's true.
No, okay, there are some examples where you can...
if you take the corn cob in Chicago, that goes up 50 stories, and they have terraces that you can come out onto. I mean, I think you have to go quite high not to be able to open the window.
Well, okay, put it another way, you have to work harder, and in most of the towers in London, that is not happening. People are not applying that kind of ingenuity.
Generally isolating structures, aren't they? I mean, they don't promote community by their very vertical nature. Human beings, being creatures that like to use gravity to walk horizontally.
I don't know, near where I live in Stockwell, there is actually some very good, I think, social housing that's been built. The Edridge House, I had a picture of it, I didn't mention it, but I talked about it. There's a series of kind of brutalist social housing that is actually really successful, I think, and it's actually stood the test of time. And there's been a study recently by King's College University into social housing in tall buildings, and it came out number 3. I mean, so in terms of livability, so I think it is possible to, and you know, we've got a huge housing crisis in this country, you know, and we need to build more affordable housing. I mean, it's just one way to do it. I'm not saying it's the only way, but I think it's, you know, there are models.
But very importantly here, you're suggesting that it's possible to build medium high-rise and to inject and to stimulate the same kind of...
About 23 stories. That's
the same kind of organic and accretive and dynamic quality that you expect in low-rise traditional communities.
Yes, you can,
It is possible.
It is.
There was a question. Sorry, you were stalled by your cough. I'm sorry, and she leapt in. Keep talking.
It's okay. Excuse me. To stick with the economic thing, when you're talking about planning obligation, I got this other thing which is coming in now, which is, you people probably know about this, which is on community infrastructure levy, and this was a policy which is now happening at London scale. It's being paid into the Mayor of London's receiving a levy, and that will soon go into boroughs, where rather than having a specific planning obligation paid for the building, they will have to pay into a fund which will then be administered by the local planning authority, and in turn might even get into the hands of neighbourhood planning forums, because they will be given a quarter of that money to use in implementing their policies. The other thing is about how I think you get the point about what neighbourhood planning could end up actually controlling heights. They could actually impose, I heard about an 8-story preference in a neighbourhood, in a residential, in a suburban area. So that could happen. There could be some more community grassroots change, and so that links onto the social agenda about building. But anyway, thank you.
Thank you. Anybody want to respond to that?
I just on the infrastructure levies. It's like 106. I mean, London planning's been poisoned by these bribes. It is not the way to plan a city. If you have a rule, which is you're going to have a zoning ratio of this or height ratio of that, that's the rule. You can't break the rule if you give me some money. I mean, we call it 106. We call it giving some money back to society or the community. It's crazy. I mean, you either have a rule, or you don't have a rule. And the whole of the planning system at the moment is really being bedeviled by these vast payments being demanded to local authority now in order to break the rule.
But I don't know that they are breaking the rules, are they?
They are breaking the rules, yes.
Are they actually...
Well, Peter, you have a more privileged view than most of us.
Yes.
Well, we've been using planning gain money to benefit in the city for years, improving our open spaces, improving the wider offer of the city, and building affordable housing in surrounding boroughs and doing training and various other things with it. So yes, it's a very useful resource. But as Simon said, if you're a local authority that's very strapped for cash, it can be terribly appealing when somebody comes along with a proposal for a very large building, and the planners are saying, oh, well, you know, it doesn't really fit the rules, and the leader of the council is saying, just a minute, look at this cheque that comes with it. So I'm sure that it does make planning more flexible.
People should pay. They should pay property taxes, which are ludicrously low. Tax people properly. Don't have these bribes. It's a terrible system.
Simon Jenkins said increase taxes. You heard it here first.
Simon's running for mayor next.
Not for the first time.
Well, it wouldn't be. I mean, Section 106 is a tax, but it's a very incompetent, badly structured tax. So I'm going to complete it with Simon on this. You should separate the idea of taxation on development and property from the idea of the public good through planning. I mean, they're just two different things, and you shouldn't let one corrupt the other.
All of which is the ideal spur to move on to our third area of conversation, which is the social value of these buildings. Before we do that, I've got a fantastic statistic for you, just relating to the environmental performance of tall buildings. One particular tall building, which is the Burj Khalifa in Dubai, on a skyline that you like, Simon. Its workers got paid $120 a month, working 6 days a week. It, of course, requires enormous desalination plants. It's in the city, of course, which has the highest carbon footprint per capita in the world, and its air conditioning, I love this, its air conditioning is the equivalent of melting 12,500 tons of ice a day. I don't know who drew that. That's a great fact. Wow. One of the tall buildings that, Julia, that you showed, I think, I couldn't tell if it was the Balfron Tower or the Trellick Tower from where I'm sitting.
The Trellick Tower is the one
on the far side.
That's listed.
Oh, no, Goldfinger's building. And,
yes.
and a listed building, which, for 20 years or so, under the GLC, was pretty much a disaster zone socially. I met people who lived there in the 1980s who said they couldn't let their children play out on the walkways because there were so many needles. It was a place where you barricaded yourself in, and yet it was also let through social housing policies to families, and designed indeed for families with three-bedroom duplexes in it. In the 1990s, the community took it over. They installed a concierge along the lines of Villeradieu's and along the lines of the original intentions of Goldfinger when he designed the building, although that was politically not acceptable to the GLC in the 60s and 70s. And that radically altered the way that people live in that building, and it's now a thriving community, albeit there's quite a lot of young single people there, but they're all having babies now and staying.
Yes, yes. Well, I think what this illustrates, though, is the fact that it's not the tall building itself that's the problem. It's actually, the way it's run and the way it's managed, in terms of residential tall buildings. And the fact is now we've got a number of tall residential towers in Canary Wharf and elsewhere that are, because they're private and they're being managed properly, there's no problem. And as you say, I think it's possible for social housing, tall buildings in social housing to be managed properly. I mean, actually, my grandmother lived in a tall council flat in Chelsea on the top floor, and it was perfectly fine. There was no stigmatism about it. I don't know what the problem is these days, that there's a kind of stigmatism about living in a council flat. What's the problem?
but Rowan, the Policy Exchange, the think tank, have said that all our tall buildings should be torn down. We should be building terraces, and that effectively the license to build tall is the license to sell privately, that it creates the exclusive space. And
well, I mean, that Policy Exchange notion was ridiculous. I mean, tower blocks were built. There were some successes, there were some failures, but in general, they are now the places where people live, form communities. And I think this idea of clearing them all away is exactly the same mistake as was made previously when it was decided that all Victorian terraces below a certain value should be cleared away on the basis that they were slums. I mean, this is really a slightly different argument from the tall buildings argument, but there's nothing intrinsically about towers that means you can't live in there, you can't have a good home there, you can't even have a family there. It's just about how you do it.
Simon, do you agree? Is it possible?
Well, I mean, the Goldfinger Tower was one of my aliens from outer space. I mean, it doesn't fit into any plan for that part of London. It just happened to arrive there. And it was a nightmare until they got the right people into it, bluntly.
Well, until they got the right management
system.
No,
it's the right management, not the right people.
We know what we're talking about. I mean, there's nobody meaning about
that. There's still social tenants in the building. There's still social tenants on the scheme.
They got the right management, but you use all the politically correct language. But going back to the terraced house, you've never got a better way of Jane Jacobs, the least influential writer on cities, made the point. There's nothing so pure as a terraced house and a terraced street. It was a perfect community, and the architecture profession have tried to deny her ever since. They've smashed them down, they've built up, they've built slabs, they've built deck access, they've built podiums. None of them have the intrinsic appeal or the livability of an old-fashioned terraced street. And I don't agree. I mean, we make do. We will make do. We could have made do with Haygate and Aylesbury, I imagine. We make do with badly built buildings. The Robin Hood estate could have been nicely built. The Smithsons kept saying they sent the wrong people to live in them. These houses can be used. Human beings are amazingly adaptable, but they aren't ideal cities. I still feel, I'm afraid, ideal cities were the cities built by the Victorians.
Peter, can you, is it possible to take Robin Hood Gardens and take Sheffield, the Park Hill, and these larger kind of high-rise structures, the Smithson utopian estates, and do something with them which is on the one hand social and productive, and on the other doesn't exclude social tenants?
You can make most building forms work if you manage them in the right way. Park Hill in Sheffield and what Urban Splash are doing at the moment, they're turning it into a desirable place to live. The highest density, on the other hand, in London is Chelsea, without its few high-rise, with its low terrace buildings. That's the highest residential density in the whole of London. So that model can work. Equally, you look at what people like Darbourne and Dark did in the 70s in Vauxhall Bridge Road with Livingston Street Estate. Wonderful, sort of enclosed communities protected from the noise and bustle of London, but with a real sense of green and community and attractiveness to live in. The high-rise buildings can be adapted. It's often a case of finding the right sort of tenants. Look at what the sort of projects Pocket Living are doing on high-density housing around London for affordable housing. I mean, I'm a complete hypocrite because I'm waiting to move into a 27-floor flat in the city. It does have openable windows, by the way, and a balcony. But you know, I mean, I can say that I don't think we should be going for the high-rise solution for residential, but at the same time thinking, well, if there are some of them there, I'd better live in one of them because otherwise they'll all be empty.
We come back, as ever, to this issue of quality, do we not? Management, quality, beauty. The skyline hasn't it doesn't cut it for a lot of people, Simon. This issue of the kind of the long distance view. Your book is about this, the view as being an essential civilized component of life. Yeah?
Yeah, I'm intrigued by what constitutes a good view. I mean, it's largely a rural phenomenon rather than an urban one. But no, I mean, I think there is such a thing as a beautiful city. I mean, San Gimignano is a beautiful city of towers. There are very good towers, some people once built. And I think London could have got it right back in the 60s. It could have made a decision. It would have required, as Peter says, ruthless government rather than the sort of chaos that we had. It's just a great pity. I mean, it's a tragedy. We've got to live with it. We've got to make the best of it. But it isn't the perfect city.
Did we go wrong somewhere? Should we throw it to the floor? Does anybody like to think that there is a turning point? Was there a souring after the war when we started to build over all those bomb sites? Sir? Can we have a microphone?
Thank you. What's been missing from this discussion are a number of things, two of which are scale, and the other is the history of all this, which Simon Jenkins, to do him justice, has touched upon, but hasn't dealt with adequately. The office boom was the break. This is the history of London since the office boom. Now, despite what Julius said, I don't think there are more than 24 office buildings in the whole of Greater London which are worth looking at. It's the most abysmal quality of architecture probably in Northern Europe. And commercial architecture has been a disaster, right? One is its speculative nature. They don't know who is going to occupy it, and therefore it's built cheaply and occupied on a fairly rapid turnover. And the other is the architects are too beholden to crass commercial considerations.
So your chief beef is with the quality of the design.
Yeah, no one said what is quality. If you're going to have, everyone talks about high quality architecture. What is high quality architecture, and can we have some examples? Cabe didn't give any example at all of a large development that it was able to attach the term quality to. And I don't believe any of our panel.
Let's ask them. Let's ask them to defend themselves. Can you define quality?
Well, I tried to do that with using the listed buildings that have been acknowledged by English Heritage as being buildings of quality. You know, I think there's a robust spare use of material. There's simplicity. There's choosing the right ingredients. In other words, quality materials, and creating. You know, this is just choosing buildings that happen to have been listed after, you know, the Second World War. You know,
you haven't outlined none of you have outlined the conditions. I accept there may be conditions under which high-quality buildings succeed. I think Barbican is a good example of that.
Peter, well, Peter is a planner, so I'd like to know what.
No, I've got great sympathy.
That issue. Now, outside that, we have two contributions to high buildings. One is the office boom, and that's been abysmal. And I think we should say 99% of of office accommodation that's been built has been awful, worse than what you'll find in Northern Europe, the most obvious comparison. And the second is the high-rise commercial building, and the lesson of that was to go, as Simon Jenkins indicated, for low-rise, high-density.
I think there might be a third category, which is the quantity of medium to high-rise residential construction, which is happening along the south bank of the Thames.
Okay, go for terraces and go for low-rise, high-density.
Can we have a chance to answer the question?
I'd like to know what Peter thinks, what the definition of good design is.
In the mid-80s in the city, when the Big Bang came along and we had to suddenly accommodate a lot more people, commercial architecture was the pits. The architects who worked on commercial architecture never did anything else. They just wound the handle and delivered the same scheme time after time and dared the planners to refuse it. All the buildings were the same. And I arrived with an extra planning tool in my armoury, and that was a low threshold of boredom. And the developers started realising that if they couldn't get me on side, they weren't going to get planning permission. And maybe if they engaged better architects and had more interesting buildings, they might capture my support, and I might recommend the schemes and help them. A few years ago, I think 3 years ago now, I had a call from Time Out saying that they wanted 2 pages for their Time Out tourist guide to London on commercial buildings in the City of London, because tourists were coming to London wanting to look at new commercial buildings. Because by then we'd had some of the world's greatest architects from this country and abroad wanting to design commercial buildings. You're right, it's been an uphill struggle, not helped by the banks. Luckily, banks don't get involved in property any longer, because all they ever wanted to do was to lend a lot of money for a very short period and take a huge profit out of it. What we're now seeing is people investing in real estate, not in property development. It's people from around the world wanting a slice of London, wanting a slice of the city, to have for security for their money. And it's that kind of investment and the owner-occupier development of office buildings, which we're also seeing, which produces the equivalent of the Rockefeller Center. If you're prepared to stick your name on it, you're going to produce a much better building than, as you say, if you're just providing a pile of speculative floor space for a quick return.
I think one of the buildings the gentleman might be alluding to is Trellick Tower, which is listed, but which you abhor, Simon.
Well, I can remember in English Heritage, back when I was involved in listing there, we had endless discussions about what we should do with post-war buildings. And one thing that's been fascinating to me is that I have to say, you assume that the buildings that go up in your generation are the worst, and they were always better before. I don't know, I just am absolutely convinced the buildings that have gone up in the last quarter century are incomparably better than the ones that went up in the quarter century before that. And I found the listing, we had great battles over this, the listing of Trellick Tower, the listing of some of Seafort's appalling buildings, the listing of the South Bank, I thought it was just a pity. And it actually brought into disrespect or contempt what I only called good architecture. These were not good buildings. They were exactly as the gentleman describes them. They've been saved. I kept saying listing isn't saving, listing's noting. They should have been noted, all right, for historic reasons. They didn't need to be saved.
Can I, in answer to your question, what are the conditions for good architecture? That does include good planning. And I think a lot of what we've seen in terms of bad tall building over the last 50, 60 years has been to do with the weakness of the planning system, the failure of the planning system to support good design. And I mean, Peter has this very personal, individualistic approach, which, sort of works in the City of London, but that doesn't work across the whole of London because it relies on a kind of level of personal input from both the planner and the the architects, that's probably not sustainable. But for me, a good planning system is one that sets some clear principles that are well thought out, which are thought out in relation to what the city as a whole should be, and which are then stuck to and not argued about. And we probably don't have time to say more than that, but I'd say that's, if you look at where the places in London where the very worst tall buildings or any kind of building are being built, it's a symptom of a failure of the planning system. And I think, to give an example, the worst place in London for every kind of planning you can imagine is the area around Vauxhall. Both tall buildings, design of buildings of any height, public realm, everything. And that's a lot to do with the fact it's on the periphery of Lambeth and Wandsworth. Neither council cares greatly about that bit of their territory. They don't like each other. They're much more interested in raising planning gain from those locations so they can spend it somewhere else where the votes are. And I think there's a very direct correlation between that political situation and the quality of the urban environment.
I wouldn't disagree with that.
I think it's been a fascinating discussion. We're going to have to wrap it up. One thing that has emerged that I'm interested by is this distinction between good and bad, and how that is facilitated, how great buildings are brought into being as opposed to poor quality architecture. I'm interested by your point, Simon, that actually it's improved over the past quarter century, that we have a number of great buildings from the 1940s onwards which have been listed, and whether we enjoy them personally or not, they represent the best of their time, and that with the passing of the years, we come to love them. You may be right about Seaford, but I suspect a great number of people here would not like to see Centrepoint demolished. Let's just take a vote. How many people like Centrepoint? How many people actively do not and want to see it pulled down? What about Trellick Tower? How many people would like to kick everyone out and knock it down? Let's have a raise. And how many people would like to keep that listed building? Already there's a division. And let's just return to the question of the evening. Are tall buildings blighting our skyline? Those in favour? And those against? Well, I reckon that... Ooh, I think...
shifted our way.
Yes, and how many don't quite know? Because a lot of you didn't put your hands up. More than that.
There's a lot that don't quite know that they don't quite know.
On the subject of don't like know, I'm going to close with a quote from Edward Glaser, who's Harvard Professor of Economics and is author also of Triumph of the City, in which he writes, "I don't think there's any evidence that suggests that skyscrapers are profoundly deleterious to cities. I don't think they destroy urban spaces when properly done. On the other hand, it's certainly possible to have a vibrant, wonderful urban space without skyscrapers, Greenwich Village being one, Paris being another." The phrase there I like is properly done. Thank you all very much for coming, and I'd like to ask you to join me in thanking our guests. Thank you.